Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. It must have been that Groundhog Day feeling as representatives from 6 world powers and Iran huddled in Vienna this Wednesday to hammer out a nuclear deal by the end of June. It was their first meeting since reaching an inconclusive agreement in Lausanne in early April. At stake is much more than curbing Iran's atomic activities, though. If a final accord is struck, it could pave the way for Iran's rehabilitation in the eyes of the West. To talk us through the next steps, I'm joined by Robert Litwak, Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He served on the National Security Council in President Clinton's administration in the 1990s. Thank you very much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you.
Do you think we are going to see a deal by June the 30th?
I think we will see a deal by June 30th, but it's going to be a heavy lift. Einstein famously said that politics is more difficult than physics, and I think these long drawn-out negotiations have borne out that observation. The issues are the perennials: sanctions, inspections, modernization of centrifuges. But the political overlay dominates, namely that the issue, both in Washington and Tehran, is a symbol for a more fundamental debate. In Iran, what kind of state does Iran want to be? A revolutionary state or an ordinary country integrating into the system? In Washington, whether the threat posed by a state like Iran, which Washington calls a rogue state, stems from the character of the regime or from its conduct.
Do you think these debates are really playing out in the kind of deal that we might see?
The deal represents the strategic sweet spot for Iran. Iran has no urgent necessity for nuclear weapons, so the framework agreement, which allows Iran to maintain a sizable nuclear infrastructure, does allow Iran keep the nuclear weapons option open for the future. But the agreement bounds the program such that a potential breakout period for weaponization would be at least 1 year.
So let's talk a little bit more about the key issues in the next few weeks. Of course, sanctions relief is something that Tehran keeps insisting on, but realistically, we're not going to see total reversal of sanctions on June the 30th, are we, whatever happens?
No, I think with the rollout of the agreement on April 2nd, one saw dueling narratives. Washington issuing its fact sheet that laid out its understanding of the agreement, an understanding that the Russians supported, saying that the American fact sheet was a true reflection of what was agreed in Lausanne. The Iranians, perhaps with an eye towards the June negotiating deadline, spinning things their way, with the Supreme Leader saying that the American fact sheet was devilish, and each side trying to put its cast onto the agreement.
But the devilish quote you refer to, I mean, this is just posturing, isn't it? The fact is that they need the sanction relief. So in a sense, don't they need this agreement more than the other powers?
Well, the posturing lies in the timetable. The Iranian position is all sanctions should be lifted simultaneously with the conclusion of an agreement in June. The American side, supported by its P5 negotiating partners, saying that the lifting of sanctions would be phased in tandem with Iranian compliance.
But mechanically, you can't just lift sanctions in one day anyway. So can you just talk us through a little bit of the different centers of sanctions? Because you've got the EU, the UN sanctions, and the most complex ones to repeal are those in the US Congress.
Politically, the multilateral sanctions may be the easiest ones to lift. Because in the United Nations Security Council and within the European Union, the political overlay of these negotiations is different. In Washington, going back to my starting point, the Iran nuclear issue is a symbol for a much broader debate about Iran, its regional policies, its state sponsorship of terrorism. One line of criticism of the agreement has been that the nuclear deal does not address these other areas of concern, and that's been a strong kind of critique of it. The Obama administration has pushed back that the agreement addresses an urgent threat.
Right. So Obama is trying to avoid this linkage that other political forces are trying to make to these other issues.
Yes, it's a subtle argument. President Obama is eschewing overt linkage between the nuclear issue and other questions. But there's a tacit linkage. I think this agreement, if implemented, would buy time, about 10 years. And President Obama is essentially betting that with 10 years, there may be the prospects for a more favorable evolution within Iran that would lead to better, less destabilizing behavior in other areas.
And of course, the counter-argument to that his foes always roll out is that, on the contrary, if you give Iran some breathing space, it's going to extend its influence, whether in Yemen or other parts of the Middle East.
Precisely, that the lifting of sanctions would give Iran access to billions of dollars in revenue that could be used to finance this objectionable conduct in other areas. Yemen, Syria, its relationship with Hezbollah, it is listed as a state sponsor of terrorism by the U.S. State Department.
Do you think basically the White House does believe that Iran could become, to use your language at the beginning of this interview, a ordinary state rather than a revolutionary state? Do you think there are people in Washington, perhaps not just in the White House, who believe sincerely that that is a realistic scenario in the future?
There is. It remains to be seen, because in Iran there is a deep state, the deep revolutionary security state. They control the arms. They were the ones that suppressed the Green Movement in 2009. They would have the control over nuclear weapons. But it was clear in Lausanne, if you saw the reporting coming out of Lausanne, that the ordinary state guys, so to speak, were the ones in the negotiating room, and they would get on the line with their counterparts in Tehran, trying to urge them to accept this deal. So there's clearly a cleavage within the Iranian political system, and that's the big unknown, this sort of social science experiment, so to speak, whether buying time would allow this to play out. One should note that there have been tantalizing prospects in the past. Rouhani was preceded by another reformist president, Khatami. And what's happened with reformist presidents is they've never really been prepared to take on that revolutionary deep state.
And presumably the bet in Washington is that, giving Rouhani some more room to maneuver could actually lead to him succeeding where Khatami failed. Perhaps that's a utopian idea, but that's something that circulates.
Well, Rouhani, it would give him a political win. It would lead potentially to tangible benefits that would fuel the Iranian middle class, the commercial class, and you'd begin to develop interest groups in favor of rapprochement with the outside world and the great Satan in particular.
Robert, obviously we have to talk about all the rowback against these kinds of ideas coming from mostly conservative political forces in the US, but not only conservatives, about the weakening of America's traditional relationships with the Israelis and the Saudis and the Gulf states. How much influence do those arguments have?
Those arguments carry powerful weight. The dispute between President Obama and Netanyahu was a technical one with political implications. The Israelis, with reason, given the rhetoric coming from Tehran, wanted a full rollback of the program, where Iran would have no hedge, no potentiality in the future of acquiring a nuclear weapon, a potentiality which this bounded nuclear program coming from these negotiations would leave Iran with that option down the line, albeit with safeguards to ensure that there would not be any immediate breakout. So the United States fell off the position of a full rollback because it was not a position that realistically could be pursued in the negotiations. But that requires special efforts to reassure our allies, Israel specifically, starting with Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, which might flirt with the possibility of acquiring its own nuclear weapon if it perceived a drift toward nuclearization in the Middle East.
Do you think President Obama's current position on Yemen is somehow helping to sort of, in a sense, rebuild or to reverse some of that mistrust with the Saudis? Or on the contrary, is he seen, do you think, in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as being too sort of passive on the Yemen issue?
Well, I refer to the current nuclear crisis with Iran and its embedded regional context as the Cuban Missile Crisis meets the 30 Years' War, because the nuclear negotiations are playing out in this broader regional context, and it's a complicated one. The United States is tacitly aligned with Iran in Iraq, opposed in Syria, opposed in Yemen. A danger in the Yemen situation, and where you had U.S. naval vessels deployed to interdict possible Iranian arms shipments, is that you could have an incident that could escalate and would then become the main issue in the U.S.-Iranian relationship and would greatly complicate the prospects for the P5+1 negotiations.
One area of cooperation, or at least tacit cooperation, that is often referred to is the U.S. and Iran over the Islamic State group. But we need to, I think, put that in context that there's a real limit to how far that cooperation goes, because, as you alluded to, in Yemen there's a limit, and in Syria there's a limit as well to that U.S.-Iranian cooperation.
Well, the conflict, the campaign against ISIS is sort of the ground zero of the sectarian kind of rift in the region. And the narrative coming from Gulf Arab states is that the United States is tacitly aligned with Iran, furthering Shiite interests in Iraq by pushing out an ISIS group. I mean, ISIS is a militant Sunni group, but it is, and it's a testimony to sort of the breakdown of the political order in Iraq, that ISIS can claim the mantle of Sunni leadership in that country, and it just points to the complex sectarian overlay of the nuclear negotiations that any U.S. administration has to deal with, and the Americans have not been particularly adept at reading all of these trends.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for your insights, Robert Litwak, Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Do join us again soon for another edition of The Interview here on France 24.